So first of all, thank you for coming out tonight. I'm thinking it's kind of gloomy weather and it's a gloomy topic, so it fits really well. And thank you to the city of Wilsonville for this opportunity. We've been doing these presentations all around the metro area with government entities, with schools, and with grassroots human rights groups. So we're happy to be able to do this. So I want to start with this. Worthless Jews like you should jump off a bridge. Dirty Jew, you should hang yourself in a gas chamber. Okay, that may sound like an anti-Semitic rant from a neo-Nazi, but in fact, it was a verbal attack on an 11-year-old boy by 12 and 13-year-old boys in a local middle school. And it has gotten to the point where the parents of that child have actually taken him out of the school because they don't feel he's safe there, and he's finishing the year remotely. I wish I could tell you that that is exceptional, but it's not. It's not unique. We've been dealing with this sort of problem in many schools. And then there's the case of the University of California, Santa Cruz. 2 weeks ago was April 20th. Can anyone tell me historically whose birthday is on April 20th? Hitler. So there was a group of students that decided to have a birthday party, a birthday celebration. So they sang happy birthday to Hitler, and they had a cake decorated with hate symbols. You can't make this stuff up. So yes, anti-Semitism is a very serious and growing problem. And I will mention that we see it on every level, on each end of the political spectrum. Okay? It's not restricted to Democrats or Republicans. It's not restricted to people who are politically conservative or politically progressive. It's all around. And so it's really important that we do these talks because we want you to understand exactly what it is. And what we find from surveys, for example, George Washington University recently did a survey of 10,000 individuals ages 13 to 35, and the majority of them did not know what anti-Semitism is. Other surveys have shown that as many as 1 out of 6 American adults said they've never even heard of the word. And for our community, that's very astonishing and alarming. So we're going to talk about maybe why that is, and we're going to talk about what it looks like in different forms and how it's being normalized in American society. So first off, the question is, do you even know who Jews are? Sounds like a kind of a silly question, but oftentimes we are characterized as a quote-unquote white religious community. So you're looking at me and you say, well, you're white. She's white, right? Okay. It's interesting because I don't know too many Jews who actually identify by the color of our skin, first of all. Second, I would say that that misconception that Jews are a white religious community is reflected in something that Whoopi Goldberg said on The View, for which she was suspended about a year ago and has since actually doubled down. She made comments that were offensive to our community. I won't go through all of them, but the one that really sticks out is when she said that the Holocaust is about white people doing it to white people. That's wrong on so many levels. Because, first of all, it's a blind spot. It's pigeonholing Jews into a box into which we don't really fit. Historically in Europe, Jews were never considered white. We were the other. In Nazi Germany, we were certainly not considered to be white. We were considered to be an inferior Semitic race. When I use that term Semitic, like anti-Semitic, which is, anti-Semitic is sort of a misnomer, because Semitic people come from a certain region in the Middle East, and it includes Arab people. But anti-Semitism is not hatred against Arab people. It's hatred against Jews. So there's that issue. And when we talk about Jews as a white religious community, it erases our concept of peoplehood. And by the way, we were a people before we had the religion. And it erases the identity of a not insignificant minority of American Jews who are people of color. For example, my wife. My wife, who is Israeli, her parents were from Iran, and she's decidedly not white. Very much she is brown-skinned, and there are Jews of all skin colors. So I don't even like to use the term white. I use the term white presenting. That doesn't mean I don't know that I have white privilege, right? And I have to own up to that. But I will tell you that the privilege that Jews have is not going to protect us from being victims of anti-Semitism. And so we know from surveys that a lot of people just don't know what it means. It's not opposition to the way we worship. Oh, it used to be a long time ago, but now it's just out and out Jew hatred. That's what it is, okay? And so why is it that people don't understand how it works? Because they look at the Jewish community in America and they don't understand that we're actually historically marginalized. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But Jews in America have largely, quote unquote, made it. We're assimilated into American society. We're disproportionately represented in positions of government, business, media, okay? But we could say the same thing about the Jews of Germany back in the 1920s when thousands of German Jewish men fought in World War I for Germany. There were Jewish doctors and lawyers. There were, again, Jews disproportionately represented in certain professions. And yet 20 years later, they were sent on boxcars to their death. Who would have thought that back in the 1920s? So we know from our very long history that wherever Jews have lived, eventually, without exception, eventually, we would be either forced to convert to another religion, we would be persecuted and perhaps murdered, or we would be expelled. If you looked at a map of the European communities where Jews were expelled, it would be mind-blowing, because hundreds of communities where Jews at first were welcomed and then ultimately were not. Like in Poland. In Poland, where many of us who are Eastern European origin, some of my family came from Poland. I think they actually lived there in the 1500s, and eventually, and they were welcomed, but eventually, you know what happened, okay? Out of 3.3 million Polish Jews, 3 million were murdered during the Holocaust. So the other issue is when you see us as white, then you probably attribute those sort of characteristics that people attribute to white people. So like, what am I talking about? For example, when you see white, what are the attributes that we associate with people who are white?
Educated.
Okay, educated, okay. What else?
Skin color.
Well, yeah, but, right. I'm not talking about physical attributes, but how about power?
House.
How about privilege, right? How about affluence? Okay, those are typically, so they see us in that category, and they don't understand how can you, for someone who's white presenting, my term, how can you feel vulnerable? Well, I'll tell you, because it's baked into our DNA. And when you understand what's happening in our country, then you'll really understand why. Our current Secretary of State said this. He is Jewish, by the way. And basically, you know, we're the canary in the coal mine. And what we say in our community is, hatred may start with us, it will not end with us. And if it starts somewhere else, eventually it'll probably get to us. And then right before Passover, just about a month ago, President Biden was making a statement to the Jewish community in which he talks about how hate really never goes away. It just needs a little bit of oxygen, right? What sort of oxygen is hate getting these days? Anyone?
Proud Boys.
Again?
Proud Boys.
Proud Boys, right, okay, but yes, yes. Certainly radicalization. What else?
Social media.
Social media. How about COVID? How about our kids coming out of COVID? They've been at home, they've been looking at social media, probably age-inappropriate social media. That's what we're learning now in some of the schools. Yes, and then there's the political discourse in our country. All of that is a sort of a perfect storm. That's the sort of oxygen. But what I think is really important about what he says is that we can't allow it to be normalized. And our fear is that anti-Semitism is becoming normalized. And we'll show you how that works. So that kids don't just make these things up. They learn it somewhere. Maybe they learn it at home. Maybe they see it on TV. Maybe they get it from social media. We had kids, very young kids, who were doing a Hail Hitler, and they said they saw it on South Park or a clip of South Park. I've never watched South Park, so So anti-Semitism, how has it changed? Well, in my parents' generation, so my father was born in Portland in the 1920s, and at that time, anti-Semitism looked different. First of all, we have a Jewish community center. Has anyone been to our Jewish community center in Southwest Portland? Do you know why we have have our own Jewish community center? Because of places like the Multnomah Athletic Club that did not allow Jews to become members until the late 1950s, or the University Club, or the Arlington Club even later. And Jews also built the Tualatin Country Club because we weren't allowed to be members at Waverly, at Portland Golf Club, which was 3 miles from where I grew up. That's in my father's lifetime, and even some of it in because they didn't allow Jews until the early 1970s, so we're even talking about my lifetime. Jews were restricted in terms of quotas, in terms of certain professions that they were restricted at getting into. They were restricted in terms of getting into certain universities. And of course, there were immigration quotas. At a time when Jewish refugees were begging to come to this country, not just during the Holocaust, but even before, our doors, our shores were closed. And a lot of that had to do with deep-seated widespread anti-Semitism. Think about Henry Ford and Father Coughlin and those folks who had audiences of millions at the time. And in our State Department, during the Holocaust, doing everything possible to keep Jews out when they could have possibly escaped during the Holocaust, especially in the very early years. So thankfully that's not happening. And there were neighborhoods where Jews were not allowed to live, and thankfully that's not happening anymore. So it's changed. It doesn't look like it did back then. So here's 2 photos, and we're going to talk about these. So the photo on the left, we'll get to that eventually. That's a person who's probably protesting against Israel, and instead of an Israeli flag with a Star of David, it's, as you can see, a Nazi swastika, and I want to be careful. I use that term swastika. I know I shouldn't, because it's a very sacred symbol to the Hindu community. It's actually a hooked cross, but since that's what everyone is familiar with, I'll keep referring to it as a Nazi swastika. And then, who recognizes the photo on the right? Charlottesville. These nice gentlemen were marching, ostensibly in protest against the removal of a Confederate statue on the campus of the University of Virginia. And they were marching and they were chanting. Anyone know what they were chanting? Jews will not replace us. What does that mean? Jews will not replace us. So this is one of the tropes that we find on some of the hate platforms, and certainly amongst people like the Proud Boys and other white nationalists, that it is, now keep in mind that Jews are probably less than 2% of the American population, but somehow we have all this power, right? And the Jews shall not replace us is because Jews, according to the theory, are orchestrating this campaign to bring all these people of color into our country, thereby changing the demographics so that the white people in this country will no longer be a majority, threatening the ideal of a white ethno-state. That's what they're talking about. And if you notice the way they're dressed, okay, forget the Hail Hitler and the tiki torches, they're dressed like normal people. I remember neo-Nazis in our community. They didn't look like that. They're dressed this way on purpose because they want to be seen as part of the mainstream in our society. So the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, did a research over the last 3 years, and they had 11 different anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic tropes. And here's what they found. So 1 out of 5 Americans, 1 out of 5 agreed with over half of those anti-Semitic tropes. 85% of Americans believed at least one of them, and you'll see what some of them are. About 2 out of 5 Americans believe Jews are more loyal to the state of Israel than we are to our own country here, the United States. About 1 in 4 say Jews have too much power in business. About 1 in 5 say Jews don't care about anybody but themselves. And also 1 out of 5 believe that Jews are more willing than others to use shady practices to get what we want. Okay? That's what we have in our country. And those percentages are alarming to us. So anti-Semitism, what does it look like? Well, some of it's obvious. Some of it may not be so much. Okay, this was Congregation Beth Israel in Northwest Portland. This is our largest congregation. This was spray painted Die Juden, Die Jews. This person who did this also vandalized an Islamic center in Northeast Portland. He was caught and he was arrested and he's going to trial because he pled not guilty. That'll be an interesting trial. Okay, sure you've been hearing about this guy, okay? And, well, so, you know, if you had followed him on Twitter, this is just one example of the sort of anti-Semitic rants or threats that he's made toward Jews. And what's alarming, because I hear comments like what you just said, or, you know, he's stupid, or he's mentally ill, he's crazy. You know what? He has more followers than there are Jews on the planet. And he's an influencer, right? So he can incite, without even maybe meaning to, but he can incite someone who follows him to commit violence. That's what's scary about him. By the way, he was a guest at Mar-a-Lago not too long ago. We'll talk about that coming up. Go ahead. So this, the New York Times printed this cartoon in color, of all things, and we're wondering, how did it get past an editor? So what you see there, that's the face of the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. You got the Star of David, just to make sure everyone knows this is a Jew. And he's leading around a blind President Trump. There's a trope that goes with this. The trope is that Jews control our foreign policy, even if it's not in the interests of the United States. Here's another example. So Congresswoman Ilhan Omar from Minnesota, Somali refugee, she's replying to this comment that essentially is that it's like all these people in Congress are defending the state of Israel. Now, the state of Israel is the only Jewish majority state in the world. There are 57 Muslim majority states. There are 158 Christian majority states. There's one Jewish state. But anyway, so this person, Glenn Greenwald, this commentator, is talking about how is it that they defend Israel all the time? And her comment is, it's all about the Benjamins. The Benjamin Franklin on the $100 bill, right? It's all about Jewish money. Again, we're so powerful that we can control our government, our foreign policy with our money, because we're all rich, you know. There aren't any poor Jews, right? So that's something that she apologized for. I should have mentioned that New York Times editorial cartoon. The New York Times apologized for it. Of course, usually when an apology comes, it's too late. And their apology said, we, the New York Times, had become numb to anti-Semitism. So the FBI keeps hate crime statistics, and what you should understand about these statistics is that they are underreported, maybe grossly underreported. But what we know, and by the way, they're very slow to get them out, so they just came out with 2021. And what we know about it is that when you look at religiously motivated hate crimes, the majority are targeting Jews or Jewish institutions. somewhere between 52% to as much as 57, 58%. And you can see the numbers here. The anti-Jewish hate crimes jumped from 2020 to 2021 from 676 to 817. So the percentage went down, but the absolute numbers went up. And we know from the Anti-Defamation League that in 2022, there were over approximately 3,700 anti-Semitic hate incidents, some of which rose to the level of hate crime. This past year, that was an over 30% increase. And so now you're starting to know why we feel vulnerable. Okay, here's an example. So this former employee of the University of Michigan threatening any Jew who worked for the state of Michigan's government that they either had to leave or confess. I don't know what that meant, or they would be murdered, right? He was arrested, thankfully, okay, but that was out there. That was more obvious. Here's another obvious. The worst attack on Jews in American history happened a little over 4 years ago in Pittsburgh, a synagogue called the Tree of Life, where on our Sabbath, on a Saturday morning, a white nationalist entered into the synagogue and gunned down 11 peaceful worshipers. Now the question is, why that synagogue? Why did he choose that synagogue? And let's go back to the march. Jews shall not replace us. This synagogue was working with an agency called the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. And they were working to bring in Syrian refugees, not Jews. There are no Jews left in Syria. They were all forced to leave. Christians and Muslims. They were trying to bring them into our country to provide safe haven from the Syrian civil war. So here was this guy, the Jews, there they are. There's that campaign to bring in people of color into our country. Okay, it's the Jews who are behind it, right? That's why he chose this synagogue, because they were working to do that. I'll get to you, yeah. So he's going on trial this week. He pled not guilty. We know what he did, so I hope he doesn't, somehow use it as a platform. Go ahead, next. So in the Middle Ages, there was this, we call it a blood libel, where Jews were blamed for killing Christian children and using their blood to bake our Passover matzahs. Okay? Yeah, it sounds ridiculous. So is this. So QAnon has sort of a similar anti-Semitic undertone about a cabal who's running a child sex trafficking ring, and Jews are a part of that. If you dig deep into this theory, you'll find that Jews are a part of that, right? And it's crazy, but we had several people running for Congress who are believers of this insane conspiracy theory, right? And, some of them actually won, right? So then, I love this quote because I think it's so poignant from Bret Stephens, a New York Times columnist. A nation that can bring itself to believe anything about anything will, sooner or later, have little trouble believing the worst about Jews. This comes right out of Nazi Germany. Okay, it starts with words, propaganda, dehumanization, incitement, violence, murder. Anybody know who this guy is? Recognize?
Yeah, he went to dinner with Trump.
He went to dinner with, yes, he was one of the guests along with Kanye West at Mar-a-Lago. Okay, Nick Fuentes is a white nationalist. Now, again, I'm not trying to get political here because I'm showing you examples on both sides of the political aisle, but the idea that he was a guest of our former president. And so here he's talking about, well, guess why it took so long to overturn Roe v. Wade? Again, it's that Jewish power. It was us, the Jews, who prevented it from happening. And what's frightening is that he has this organization, America First, and he has a conference once a year, and he invited 2 of our members of Congress who spoke at his conference. The fact that he's a white nationalist, not a problem. See, now you're starting to understand it's becoming normalized in some ways, right? Okay, I want you to, now, and I apologize ahead of time for what you're about to hear, but I want you to hear it. Now, before you click that on, he's talking about, you're gonna hear a clip from him. He's talking about Jews, religious Jews in the morning in their prayers, they put on what are called tefillin, phylacteries. You put it over your head and there's a cube that has prayers in the cube, sacred texts. And you also wrap it around your arms, okay? That's what he's referring to. So let's listen to, can you get it? So he's saying that he goes, you're either Catholic or you're a Jew, okay? And I don't want this country to be run by Jews. I want it to be run by Catholics. I don't want Hollywood to be run by Jews. I want it to be run by Catholics. And I don't have a problem with that. You may have a problem with that, but that's the way it is. And then he starts mocking Jews who do this ritual. It's too bad. I mean, in a way, I'm glad you couldn't hear it because it's really inappropriate. But this is, the point is that this person was invited to be a guest of our former president. Next. Okay, here's another example. So when we talk about press credentials, you think of New York Times, Wall Street Journal, CNN, ABC News. Okay, I bet you never heard of True News. True News is a streaming platform run by a pastor in Florida named Rick Wiles, who is a virulent anti-Semite. And he is going to explain to you that it was the Jews who orchestrated the impeachment of President Trump. And here's what he said about us. This is the way that Jews work. They are deceivers, they plot, they lie, they do whatever they have to do to accomplish their political agenda. You know, the Jews have a political agenda. There you go. He also blamed Jews for COVID. He said Jews were seen going into the synagogues and coming out with COVID, and now they're making money off of the vaccines. But, laugh, but they were given the same press credentials as those other media outlets that I just mentioned. And that means they could cover the White House in the same way that ABC News, New York Times, what have you. A lot of Facebook followers. I haven't even updated that. I stopped updating it. Over 200,000 Facebook followers. Ah, yes. I know you two wanted to hear about this guy, Fritz Bergeron, who is in the Biden State Department. Now, he started before that, but he's still there. And he moonlights as an anti-Semitic blogger. Okay? He has a website called Blood and Faith. Here's an example. Jesus Christ came to save the world from the Jews. They who are the seed of the serpent. Jewish ideas poison people. Why is he still working as a mid-level foreign service official in our State Department? But he's there. Because why? Because he's doing this on his private time? Guess it's okay. So that's one type of anti-Semitism. Now we're going to get into the more murky type. So when we talk about this other type of anti-Semitism, it's often conflated with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I'm not here to talk about the conflict. And I will tell you that legitimate criticism of Israel, now understand Israel's connection to American Jews. Almost the vast majority of American Jews have some sort of emotional attachment to Israel because it's our ancestral homeland. So some of us have lived there. Some of us have studied there. So many of us have family there. Or we send our kids to go travel through Israel on summer trips or do gap years. So there is this connection. Maybe it's unique to our community. I don't know. Maybe the Irish have, I don't know. But we do have this connection to Israel. And we're going to talk about Zionism as well. But so legitimate criticism of Israel or Israeli policies is not anti-Semitic. It's not, okay? You want to hear criticism of Israel? Go to Israel. You'll see hundreds of thousands of Israelis protesting in the street every single week right now against the current government and its policies. And our organization has also voiced concerns about the current policies of the Israeli government. So yeah, legitimate criticism, no problem. Okay? So this movement, it stands for Boycott, Divest, Sanctions. It's an anti-Israel movement. Boycott everything Israeli, boycott Israeli products, boycott Israeli academics, Israeli speakers. If they come on college campuses, disrupt them. Divest from businesses that are operating in Israel, sanction Israel. Now, and here's what I'm going to say, and I want to be really clear here, okay? Do I believe that everyone who supports this movement is an anti-Semite? No, I don't. I don't. When we talk about the former form of anti-Semitism from white nationalists, I say the intent is there and the effect, the harmful effect, is there. Here, the intent may or may not be there, but the effect can be harmful. And I'll show you what I mean by that, okay? The United Nations put out a report where they were very clear about the tactics, objectives of this movement. Go ahead. To say that, so the objectives, activities, effects of the BDS movement, in their words, the United Nations called it fundamentally anti-Semitic. Monica Schwartz-Vriesel, one of the foremost experts on anti-Semitism, she describes this as Israel-related anti-Semitism. And she talks about it as being promoted by this movement and made respectable, that is Jew hatred, respectable, by whitewashing it as criticism of Israel. And the German parliament agreed by saying the pattern of argument and methods of the BDS movement are anti-Semitic. The French National Assembly also said something similar. Go ahead. So I want to talk about Zionism, because I know Zionism for some became a dirty word. I'm a Zionist. Okay? The vast majority of Jews in America are Zionist. What does that mean? Zionism is the right of the Jewish people to national self-determination in our ancestral homeland. By the way, our organization also supports national self-determination for the Palestinian people. We believe that that land has to be shared, but that's what Zionism is. The right of Israel to exist as the nation state of the Jewish people. And by the way, if you know about Israel, you know that there are 20% of citizens in Israel who are not Jewish, who are actually Arab citizens. So that's what I'm a Zionist. So if someone denigrates Zionists, you are dehumanizing me and many other Jews. So here's an example. Presbyterian Church USA. Okay, this is not meant to be a critique of all Presbyterians. Okay, I know we've worked with Presbyterians on many different issues. So, but this is the headquarters in Louisville, Kentucky, and they put out this pamphlet called Zionism Unsettled, and they sent it out as a study guide to all their congregations, and then it was available online. You could buy it online from the Presbyterian USA store. Here's what they said about Zionism, which for me is part of my religious and cultural identity. Zionism didn't just start in the 1800s. Okay, it's been around for years, for centuries, since Jews were expelled from ancient Israel in the year 70. There is, for people who are practicing Jews, there has always been a yearning to return to our ancestral homeland. It's embedded in our prayers. So this is what they said. It's a source of evil on par with Nazism. Heretical doctrine that fosters both political and theological injustice. Who endorsed it? Who endorsed the booklet? The former Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan and the Iranian government. So here's how it looks. Jews are very involved in social justice causes, climate change, for example, LGBTQ rights. So here was a march back in 2017 in Chicago. There were 3 Jewish women, part of the march, carrying a flag that looked like that, the rainbow colors, with the Star of David, the Jewish symbol, and they were forced to leave. Why? They refused to disavow their Zionist identity. They refused to disavow Israel. And here's what the organizers said. The women were told that the march was explicitly anti-Zionist, and if they were not okay with that, they should leave because, in their words, Zionism, quote, is an inherently white supremacist ideology. Now think about this. Jews are the main, not the only, the main target of white supremacists. And here we are called white supremacists. Doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? Now I can show you examples all night long. So on our college campuses, New York University, 51 student groups voted to boycott the 2 Jewish student groups because they were Zionist. There's a group called Students for Justice in Palestine. They're on many college campuses. Here's an example at Stony Brook in New York. We asked the university if there were Nazis and white nationalists on the campus, would their identity have to be accepted and respected? Absolutely not. Then why would we respect the views of Zionists? And City University of New York, there was an Instagram campaign, Zionism out of City University of New York. University of California, Berkeley Law School, 100 student groups, 14 of them voted to change their bylaws so that they would never have to invite a speaker who supported Israel or who is Zionist. The dean of the law school pointed out, that means that I cannot come and speak to you because I'm Jewish and I'm Zionist. To my knowledge, they haven't changed their bylaws since then. This young lady who identifies as, in her words, queer, cisgender, well, she was the vice president of the student government at USC until there was an online campaign to, pardon my French, impeach my Zionist ass. Why? Not because she was queer, but because, in her words, because she was Zionist, a supporter of Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. At UCLA, a similar situation, a member of that student government went on a trip to Israel, and when he came back was told, you cannot serve on the student government because you can't be objective on any issue. He was expelled from the government. We see this happening over and over and over again. But it's not just college campuses. The Sunrise Movement is an environmental group, and back a couple of years ago, there was a rally in support of voting rights. Okay? And there were 3 Jewish organizations, I would say progressive Jewish organizations, but also Zionist organizations, that were going to participate because, like I said, Jews are very actively involved in many social justice causes, voting rights, voter suppression, that kind of thing, election subversion. So they were coming to be part of this rally, but the Sunrise chapter in Washington, D.C. said, you know what? If they're coming, we're not going to be there, so you need to get rid of them. You need to, forbid them from coming, which they didn't. They didn't do that, but the D.C. chapter of the Sunrise Movement stayed at home. Now, the national movement disavowed that. Here's another example. So the Council of American Islamic Relations, I think, is the largest Muslim organization in the United States. And I will tell you, so I was on the Attorney General's Task Force on Hate Crimes, and I sat there with at that time, the chair of the same organization here in Portland, and we ended up working on issues together against hate, especially in the schools. We had lunch with him, great guy. Okay, but this woman is the head of the chapter in San Francisco, and she was speaking at a pro-Palestinian conference, no problem with that. But here's what she was talking about, that the people in the audience have to oppose these right-wing extremists and what she called, quote unquote, polite Zionists, by which she meant the Anti-Defamation League, which stands against all forms of hate, not just anti-Semitism, Jewish federations, that's us, and what she called Zionist synagogues, which is virtually every synagogue in the United States. I think there's one exception. The University of California Board of Regents has issued a statement against intolerance, and here's what they said, that anti-Semitism, including what they called anti-Semitic forms of anti-Zionism, have no place on their campuses. So what they're saying here is that anti-Zionism is not inherently anti-Semitic. However, They went on to say, so in other words, you can have a debate about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You can be against Israel. That doesn't make you an anti-Semite. But they pointed out that the opposition to Zionism often takes the form of assertions of prejudice and intolerance toward Jewish people and culture. And again, we see this, as I've pointed out to you, some of the examples. Bet you didn't know he said something about anti-Zionism, but he did. Again, this is his view. What is anti-Zionist? It is the denial to the Jewish people of the fundamental right we justly claim for the people of Africa and freely accord to all other nations of the world, of the globe. It is discrimination against Jews because they are Jews. So, last slide. There are different definitions, but there's one that's been the most widely accepted definition. We have adopted this definition from the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. You can Google that, look it up. There is the sort of technical definition. Now, this definition has been endorsed by 37 countries, most of Western Europe, the United States under both the Biden and Trump administrations. The United Nations Secretary General urged member states to adopt this definition of anti-Semitism. Not that many of them have, but. And here are the examples. So I hope that you've heard some of these as I've gone through this presentation. So the top one, Jews control fill in the blank. Remember, we're less than 2% of the American population, but we have all this power, so we control the banks. Okay, the banks that are failing, that's our fault. Okay? We control the economy. Interest rates going up, that's our fault, right? Jews control foreign policy. Jews control Hollywood, Kanye West. Okay? You know why there are so many Jews in Hollywood? Because it was one of the professions that Jews were actually welcomed into back in the early 1900s. That's why there are so many Jews there, disproportionately so. Okay? But we control all of these various things. And of course the media. Don't forget the media. Holocaust denial, that should be an obvious one. You know, what we hear a lot in the schools now, even among younger kids, are Holocaust jokes. My youngest son, when he was at Ida B. Wells High School in Southwest Portland, he would come home and tell me, yeah, these kids are telling jokes about the Holocaust. Okay? Holocaust denial, minimization of the Holocaust. What does that mean? Oh, yeah, there were some Jews that died during World War II. There were a lot of people who died during World War II. That's minimization. There were 6 million Jews who were murdered during the Holocaust. Again, accusing Jews of being more loyal to Israel. Dual loyalty. We've heard this at the highest levels of our government. Denying the Jewish people the right to self-determination by claiming Israel is a racist state. Okay, we hear this a lot. Israel is an apartheid state. Okay, if you've been to Israel, you know that it's not an apartheid state. Israel has problems. There's no question about it. But to use this in order to demonize and delegitimize the only Jewish state in the world is a form, according to this definition, of anti-Semitism. Or comparing Israel or Israelis to the Nazis, right? So remember the flag? Instead of the Israeli flag, we have the Nazi swastika. That is a form of anti-Semitism. And then the blood libel, which, you know, thankfully, we don't hear this very often. The Jews killed Jesus. Although, my oldest son, when he was in middle school, one of his teachers told him that Jews had killed Jesus Christ. We don't hear it much, thankfully. But again, this blood libel, as I talked about, the conspiracy theories, there's a lot of anti-Semitic undertones. So those are some of the examples of this definition. And so with that, we're going to open it up to questions. Way in the back.
How do you think the average person can help educate? I mean, like, and I'm sure I'm guilty of some of those because I'm pretty self-reflective on that stuff and I've got a lot of internal racism that I'm dealing with. But like, how do we help? Like, what do we do?
Well,
And also, shout out to Ida B. Wells, that's my alma mater.
Mine too, except it was called Woodrow Wilson. I didn't know who Woodrow Wilson really was when I went there. I know who he is now, or what he did. Anyway, so look, yeah, so what can we all do? Well, for us, education. Education is the first line of defense, okay? That's why we're doing these presentations. It's so important that we all become educated. We just met today with the superintendents of Portland and then also Beaverton, because we want to talk to them about how we can partner with them to make sure all of our kids are safe in schools. You need to speak up when you hear any sort of hate speech. We need allies, not just us. We all need to stand together against hate, because otherwise it's just going to flourish. So even if it's at the dinner table, even if it's a friend of yours or a relative of yours, if they say something that's racist or anti-Semitic or homophobic or Islamophobic, we need to let them know that's not okay. And that's what's happening with our kids right now, because they're afraid, because they don't know how to speak up. So there are programs that can train them how to do that, how to respond to become effective allies. We work with other communities, faith communities, ethnic communities, because we're all in the same boat. We did a summit 2 years ago during COVID, a virtual summit, with the indigenous and Latino and African American LGBTQ communities, because we're all experiencing this, especially in the last several years. We have to stand together. It's the only way we're going to do this. The social media issue is a problem. I wish I had an answer, but I think if you have kids in school, do you know what they're doing when they're online? I mean, these 9-year-olds were watching South Park or clips of South Park. I mean, I don't even think it's appropriate for me, you know? What? Vote. Yeah, well, vote. That's, yeah, voting is important, certainly. So parental oversight is so important now, and that's one of the things we talked about with the superintendents. You know, the problems in the schools, they're not just problems of a given school or a given teacher or a given principal. They're all our problems. It's a community problem, and there has to be a community solution. So when we talk about what's going on in the schools, it has to be training teachers, educating them about anti-Semitism, about other forms of hate. It also has to be working with the students to become effective allies, to respond to hate incidents and hate speech in a safe way, of course, and train the younger kids through role-playing and videos to do the same. There are things we can do. The online platforms that are spewing hate, I think our government has, you know, look, there's freedom of speech, I get that, but there's got to be more accountability, and right now there is none. There is none. So can we fix that problem? I don't know. But yeah, yes.
This is more of a local question, but back in December and January there were some flyers here in Wilsonville, and I'm curious if there's any update on that.
Yeah, those flyers, we've seen them in Portland and Wilsonville, West Lynn, I believe, right? I don't have any update. It's happening all around the country. These are anti-Semitic flyers that occasionally end up on your lawn or your driveway. It's a small, very, very fringe, extreme group, and they're doing this all over the country. The problem is, are they committing a crime? They're not. It's freedom of speech, okay? If they post it on a synagogue wall, then I think there's trespassing. I mean, I don't know. I'm not the lawyer. Hank's the lawyer. He can probably tell you better than I can. But there's, you know, when we have, let me just talk about security for a minute, because we have now, for the last few years, a director of community security, and she was a he, now it's a she, is our liaison to local law enforcement. And I know that for example, Portland Police Bureau has an intelligence division where they monitor these groups and to see, are they going to step over the line? The problem, of course, is that any of these kinds of activities can incite, but they can't really do anything unless there is an explicit threat or an actual act of violence. So, you know, you're probably going to keep seeing these, unfortunately. because of the free speech laws in our country. And it's sickening. And, you know, I would hope that when it happens, that people band together and say, you know what, this is not acceptable in our backyard, in our town, our community. Yeah.
We saw Mr. Biden's statement about anti-Semitism. You're connected worldwide. Is this also happening at this degree in other nations around the world?
Yeah, there is a rise in Europe, in Western Europe. Absolutely. There is a significant rise in anti-Semitism in the Arab Middle East. Yes, absolutely. It's happening all over. But, you know, we've got to deal with it here first. There was a hand up somewhere back there. Go ahead. Diane?
I was just thinking, I think we're all forgetting the power of our own voice. And if you see these flyers, instead of crumpling them, throwing away or burning or whatever, talk to your neighbors about it, and take it to the powers that be in that community. It's amazing what the power of one person can do with the community around it. Whether it's against the law or not, at least let your voice be heard. When you see something wrong, don't sit back and shirk and say, well, I can't do anything about it. Raise your voice, do something.
Thank you. And not only raise your voice, but report it. Report it, because it's a hate incident. It may not be a hate crime, but it's a hate incident. And when we report our hate incidents, some of which become crimes, that's how they decide how to deploy resources, right? So it's very important. As I said, hate crimes are vastly underreported. We know that. So report it and talk to your neighbors and speak up against it. You know, letters to the editor, those kinds of things, saying this is not acceptable in our community and we won't have it. Yes, sir.
How do we approach local school board members about this problem?
About anti-Semitism? Right. So, well, so we're doing that now. We want to make sure that they're aware that it's happening in not just West Lynn or Wilsonville, it's happening all over. There was an article in the Oregonian just the other day, middle schools, Portland middle schools crying for help because of all the behavioral issues among students, microaggressions. When I hear microaggressions, I know racism, anti-Semitism, anti-gay hate, so on. So first of all, you should know who's on your school board and are they going to address these problems. The question ultimately is, if there's an incident in the school or multiple issues in a school, is the school addressing it or not? Because if they are not able to or willing, and we find that, God bless them, some administrators who try are still not effectively addressing the problem, it has to go to the next level. That can be your superintendent, or it can be school board members. We had a problem, the problem that I mentioned at the very beginning, where we believe that the school was not effectively addressing this particular situation with this one student. So what did we do? We contacted 2 Beaverton school board members, and then we went to the superintendent to get them to make sure that this family was supported and that they were going to go back into the school and address it. Because if it happens in a school, then, and even if they can't identify the kids who are doing it, okay, a swastika carved on a bathroom door, even if they can't identify the students who did it, if it happens, number one, a letter should go out from the principal to the entire school community, including the parents, saying this is what happened and it's not acceptable, and if we find who did it, there will be consequences. But talking to your kids in every classroom about what happened, it may not be that a particular child that did this was in that classroom, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You've got to be talking about it. I'll give you the example. My youngest son was at Ida B. Wells. He was a sophomore, and that year there were so many issues going on, and I'll tell you, the parents didn't know about it. I knew about some of the anti-Semitism because of my professional role. So in May of that year, there was a walkout by students of color in protest because the administration refused to deal with the problem. Oh, there was a swastika carved on a desk. What did they do? They removed the desk. Didn't tell any of the parents. I only knew about it from a certain source. So the administration changed. We had a new principal, my son's junior year, and in August, right before school started, there was a meeting of parents to listen to a panel of 10 students, Jewish, Black, Latino, gay, to hear them about their experiences the previous year. It was heart-wrenching, I'm telling you, what these kids had gone through. And the administration did not deal with it. Did not deal with it. Now, if I had known, I would have gone to the school board or the superintendent. I would have no issue with that. However, once we all 200 parents heard about all the things that were going on, what we did was we facilitated bringing in the Anti-Defamation League's No Place for Hate, which is this very systematic training, as I mentioned, training students. They took 30 students, sophomores and juniors, trained them for 3 straight days. Want to hear what's going on in the school? Here's how you deal with it. Here's how you become an effective ally. Here's how you respond when you hear it. And here's what you do with younger kids, the freshman classes. And this can go all the way down to even elementary school, but mainly middle school and high school. Do role playing with the freshman classes. Teach them. Show them that there are kids who are willing to speak up, because so many kids are afraid to speak up. I'm going to be a snitch. I don't want to speak up. That's what I've heard over and over again. You've got to teach them to speak up, to do it safely. That's the key. Yes, sir, back there.
Say, I have a cousin who's 60 years old now. He was born into a big Catholic family. His name was Leon Winkleman. And when he was in college, he had this great big nose, so he was the Jewish boy. He got harassed so badly for being Jewish, he changed his name to Leon Wolf.
Well, Wolf is also a Jewish name.
That was 40 years ago. He was given such a hard time.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's not that anti-Semitism wasn't around, but I'll tell you, so my father's, so it's kind of, it didn't skip a generation, but my generation, in other words, my childhood, my young adulthood, you know, we didn't experience anti-Semitism like our parents did, and we didn't experience anti-Semitism like our kids are now. So when I was a kid, I went to Bridal Mile Elementary School in Southwest Portland, and the only time I experienced anti-Semitism as a child, and I'll tell you, it may sound trivial to you, but I've not forgotten it. I know where it happened, I know how old I was, and I know who did it, okay? I was on the basketball court, we were playing outside basketball, I ran into another kid going for a loose ball, we knocked each other over. This is a kid that I had known from kindergarten, blonde hair, blue eyes. We got up, he stared me down, he called me a dirty Jew. I remember it. This is the only time, okay, thankfully, but I know of other people, maybe even a little bit older than me, who experienced anti-Semitism, especially back east, where there are, you know, larger Jewish populations. But yeah, I mean, look, you know, 40 years ago, it just doesn't go away. It's never going to go away. The question is, how do we deal with it? How do we address it? Yes, ma'am.
Could you comment on the organization standuptojewishhate.org?
Oh, the campaign. So this is a campaign that's funded by the owner of the New England Patriots. And yeah, well, but so it's an online, and you might have seen the ads on TV. So it's a blue square. I'm not sure exactly why they chose that, but the idea is they show on your TV screen, they will show you a blue square that represents the 2% of the population that the Jews are in America. And then they show you a larger blue square that represents the majority of religiously motivated hate crimes that are targeting Jews. And then they do different commercials. They show different sort of scenarios where anti-Semitism takes place and how it takes place. So look, any way that we can to make people aware of this growing problem, we're going to do that. We've signed on to it. It's on our social media as well. I don't know how effective it's going to be, honestly, but it can't hurt. I think it's important. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes?
Well, you mentioned that you're currently in conversations with Portland Public and Beaverton. Have you had any conversations or planning to have any conversations with the Wilsonville Westland School District?
I'm going to let my friend Michelle answer that question. Michelle is one of our lay leaders.
Should I stand up?
Go ahead.
Hi. Well, first of all, I'll say that I'm really glad to see so many of you that turned out. We've been planning this for quite a while. And I'm fortunate enough to be a volunteer with the Jewish Federation with Bob, who's a staff member, and Rachel, who's also a staff member. And there's a few of us here tonight from what we call the lay leadership. But what I will tell you is I have 3 kids that went through the Westland Wilsonville School District. They're now all fortunately in college. Doing great, and I asked them, I said, that's because of the great parenting, right? And they said, no, it's the schools. So they received a great education, I will say that. But we dealt with anti-Semitism all the time. My daughter, who is on the leadership of the Unity Club, which is about inclusivity and all, as it implies, at Westland High, when she got back from her trip to Israel, one of the students went to the teacher leadership and tried to get her kicked off because of her Zionism. My son experienced a Heil Hitler, horrific Nazi jokes. I'm telling you all this to say that I, myself and other people in the Jewish community, some of which are here tonight that are from the Westland Wilsonville School District, the community members, we have constantly reached out to the school district, the school board, which, as you know, changes. We've gotten support, and then we've gotten, I can remember the one time I called about my daughter who was trying to get her kicked off the Unity Club, and the administrator said, I really just don't know how to handle this. We've not dealt with it before. I'm like, it's happening, you just didn't know about it. This wasn't the first time. I can go on and on about incidents. So I think your question was, what is the Westland Wilsonville School District doing about it?
If you've had conversations with Portland and Beaverton currently, any planned conversations or past conversations with the current?
Yes, so to answer your question, yes, there's been past conversations, and we are continuing to have those conversations as often as we can. I do it as a parent in the district and also as my place with Federation. And we have so many resources. We want the school district to bring in these resources where, not only do we have Bob presenting and Rachel presenting, but we partner with ADL. We partner with very well-respected curriculum developers on the Middle East. As you all know, the Holocaust bill passed a few years ago, so there's Holocaust education that needs to be brought in, ethnic studies.
And genocide.
And genocide.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of work to be done, and so, yes, I guess that was a long answer to your question.
So, yeah, I mean, if you, well, look, we're willing to work with any school district, and there's 3 things that we do. This is what we told the superintendents. Number 1, we will be advocates for our families. And that doesn't mean we don't care about the other kids. We do, because we know that if it's happening with our kids, it's happening with other kids. But we're going to be, because we get the calls from the Jewish parents. So we're going to be advocates to find ways to support that family. Number 2, presentations like this with teachers and administrators. And number 3, because we don't deal with the situation in the classroom per se, we will connect the school with the Anti-Defamation League, No Place for Hate, the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education, which has a speakers bureau of Holocaust survivors that are still out there, still willing to talk to kids of all ages. And I think it's very powerful and effective. There's Western State Center, which is a Portland-based human rights organization that does work in the schools countering online radicalization of young people. So there are resources out there, and we find that the schools don't necessarily know about them. So, you know, we're just trying to be as helpful as we can to the schools. We're not coming in with our guns blazing saying, you're not doing this. We're trying to figure out how we can collectively solve these problems. Other questions, comments? Yes?
I don't know how to say it, but why do you think Jews are being, why are the Jews?
Why are we targeted? Well, that's another 3-hour lecture. Jews have been the scapegoat for millennia. That's what I said. We have never been able to live for a long period of time in any community. When I say long, I mean it could be, you know, even centuries, but eventually we were seen as troublemakers. We were seen as refusing to accept Jesus as our Savior, as the Son of God. We were, you know, the ones controlling the money. And now, by the way, I mean, that was partly because it was one of the only professions we could do was money lending, because Christians couldn't do that. So, you know, we have been the other in almost every society we've lived in, okay? We're the convenient scapegoat. But there's, you know, I mean, like I said, I could go on and on and on. This is nothing new. I mean, look, we understand we're not the only ones being targeted. And I say, if any minority, if anyone is targeted, we're all targeted. So I feel. Okay, yes.
Following up with what you just said, hate in any form isn't any good. And it's just not the Jews that are targeted.
Absolutely.
The blacks are the groups getting together to try to get one message that's just anti-hate.
Yes.
And why it's that way?
Yes. I mean, that's what we did. We did a program, Confronting Hate. We did and you can find it on our website. So what we did was, this was during COVID, but we're continuing to work with our partners. During COVID, we did a series once a month on the history of discrimination in the state of Oregon against African Americans, Asian Americans, LGBTQ, Latino, Indigenous, Jews. Okay? And then we followed it up with a virtual summit confronting hate with all of those partners. And we talked about the contemporary issues and how can we come together to address them. We had over 1,000 people registered who eventually, maybe not that day, but eventually watched the videos. Yes, as I said, we have to come together. We can't do this alone. You know, there is a survey that showed that the majority of Americans believe Jews can solve anti-Semitism on their own. No, we can't. No, we can't. Yeah, the majority of Americans. No, we can't. We need allies. And so there are examples. For example, when we had a problem with anti-Semitism on the campus of the Portland State University a few years ago, and we felt that the university was not dealing with the problem, I reached out to a president of a Muslim mosque and to Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon and to the Catholic Archdiocese. I said, we need help. I want us to jointly write a letter to the administration because they're not dealing with it. Oh, did that get their attention? Okay? When there was an anti-Islam bill in the state legislature, the first thing I did was to call my friend, the president of the mosque, and said, are you aware of this bill? He wasn't. I said, let's write a letter jointly to every senator, all 30 senators, to make sure this bill gets killed. That's how these relationships are so critical. Can't do it alone. No one can. Look at what happens to the Asian community and how they've been targeted. So yeah, no, it's not just Jews. Of course not. Of course not. And that's why I say we find when there's anti-Semitism, yeah, there's also other stuff going on in those schools. It's never one thing. There's even microaggressions. It doesn't mean it's just targeting Jews. You never see that. It's always bigger, and we have to all deal with it together. There was the case of West Lynn Middle School. Did you read about that in the paper? Okay, West Lynn Middle School, where a black 8th grader was assaulted by 2 white 8th graders pretending that he was George Floyd. Yes. No, what did I say? Oh, sorry, West Sylvan. Yeah, West Sylvan, all the West, they're all confusing. West Sylvan. Yes, West Sylvan. Sorry, not Westland. I didn't want to, make people in Westland nervous that this happened and you didn't know about it. No. So West Sylvan. This happened at West Sylvan. Well, we learned that there was also anti-Semitism going on at the same time. And so we contacted the NAACP and said, hey, let's deal with this together. So we're trying to do that. They're still trying to figure out how they want to approach it. But so, yes, I mean, we got to work together. That's the bottom line. Yes?
Having seen a play not too long ago, it was called Good, and it was with David Tennant. My question is whether the arts are getting involved in this in terms of plays, because some of the plays that I've seen that are offered at some of the schools are so old world. It's not that I'm that knowledgeable about it, but I'm curious what you have experienced.
You want to speak to it?
Sure. I mean, there are a couple of Broadway shows right now. Leopoldstadt. Hi, I'm Rachel. I work with Bob. There are a couple of plays on Broadway right now. Parade is one with Ben Platt. Leopoldstadt is another one that Joshua Molina is in, and those are both, I know more about Leopoldstadt because I follow Joshua Molina on Instagram. But that one is about a family at the beginning in Germany in the 20s and kind of what happened following that. There's also an Instagram account called Art Against Antisemitism. So there are definitely places where it's being interrupted on the arts levels as well.
And of course, there's the Anne Frank play that is often in our communities. So, okay. Last question.
Yeah, I grew up in the southeast side of Chicago. And that was a community that was very, very diverse. The high school I went to was probably 35% Jewish. There was a Jewish temple half a block down the street. I lived in apartment buildings where in the doorway there were Zeus's. And we all got along just fine. What's changed?
Yeah.
And in those days, too, there was prejudice against, we used to tell Polish jokes, Italian jokes. Nobody was as sensitive as they are now. Everybody seemed to get along. Yeah, there were people that made comments about the Jews. There were certain terms that they used for Jews that were
derogatory.
Like the N-word for black folks.
Right.
But we all got along. And I was a commercial insurance broker in Chicago. A lot of my clients were Jewish folks. The agencies that I worked with, there wasn't any anti-Semitic, at least overt. Everybody seemed to tolerate each other.
What decade are we talking about? What decade are we talking about?
What?
What decade are we talking about?
Well, I'm 87.
Okay.
I was born in 36. I graduated from
there was
grammar school in 1950.
Okay. Well, there was anti-Semitism going on.
I know it was there.
Yeah.
But it's not like it is now.
Well, I think there are a lot of factors that you didn't have back then. The internet is one of them, right? Okay. You didn't have a pandemic, and kids coming out of a pandemic when they've been at home, stuck at home, where they've lost really, a year and a half to 2 years of their development, and we're seeing a lot of mental, behavioral issues, that kind of, you didn't have that. I mean, there are factors. I don't know, I can't speak to the 1950s, but the political discourse in this country, is a factor.
Does the growth of Zionism have a lot to do with it? I would think.
The growth of Zionism? Zionism was alive and well in that time. Yeah. I mean, Israel was established as a state in 1948, right? So, no. I mean, look, it reminds me of a scene in the movie 42, which is about, Jackie. And there's I guess it was the Philadelphia Phillies manager, and I know it was actually based on a true story where he's intimidating Jackie Robinson while he's at bat, and he's calling him the N-word, and just horrible stuff. And so when they were interviewing him, the press went down to the locker room to interview him, and they said, well, aren't you being tough on him? And he said, oh, no, we make fun of Hank Greenberg, we call him a kike. And we make fun of Joe DiMaggio, we call him, Italian slur, whatever it was, as if that was okay. I mean, so maybe we're just more attuned to it now. Maybe maybe it was more acceptable back then. I don't know. I didn't live in the 1950s. I can't tell you. I'm glad you all got along, but there were neighborhoods where, you know, Jewish kids were getting beaten up by Irish kids and Italian kids, and it was happening in the 1950s. I can tell you that.
In Dearborn, Illinois, I think it was in the 50s.
A Nazi march? Well, yeah, there was a Nazi march in Skokie, Illinois in the 1970s. So, look, times have changed. I do believe the internet has had a tremendous effect. Yeah, there is more. All right, I'll give you one more question here.
There was a Ku Klux Klan rally in Southern Oregon in the early 70s, I believe. But to the gentleman's point, I feel like as a society, we've decided that what was okay is no longer okay.
Yeah.
And when it gets called out, then people say, oh, you're being sensitive.
Right.
Or a snowflake.
Right.
Or, you know, you shouldn't worry about that because it didn't used to matter. And we've decided that as a society, it does matter.
That's
and
right.
We need to continue to change. You made a great point. Like, it was okay, and now it's not. And it's really hard for people, I think, that grew up that way for the majority of their life, who now are thrust into a situation to where it's no longer okay to change their mindset when it always has been.
Right. Think of the gay community back in the 1950s. The gay community.
Right.
Okay, in the 1950s. Exactly. Or afraid to come out. They wouldn't come out, you know? And so.
I think this is why I'm picking up on your word, which is my word, education. And meetings like this, it's so important to re-educate. I'm generational, I'm with that man up there. And we have to relearn, and not be afraid of what we don't know, what we're ignorant about. Embrace it.
So make sure this is being videotaped. Make sure that your neighbors who are not here, your friends who are not here, your relatives who are not here, make sure they watch it. Not just this one, I assume you're doing the whole series. It's important. So thank you for coming out. Appreciate it.
Before I let you go, I wanted to ask you to convey one piece of information. You talked about if you see something, report it, and I want you to go at least let people know how they would do that.
Yeah. So if there is any kind of hate incident or a potential hate crime, first thing to do is report it to your local law enforcement agency. That's very important. We have to report these because it's underreported. And there's also the Department of Justice has a hotline that you can call. If it happens in a school, make sure that you're talking to the school administration. There's also Safe Oregon. Safe Oregon, that you can leave a comment about something that has happened. There's all kinds of places to report it, but the point is to report it. Absolutely critical. For us, for the Jewish community, we have on our website, if it happens in a school in particular, they can report it on our website, and we'll get that information. And I imagine there's other organizations that have something similar. So, but yeah, absolutely, you've got to report it. We've got to make sure that people are aware that these things are happening and that we have to be able to address it as a community, and we can't do that if it's not getting reported. Yes.
I just wanted to add that I appreciate our local newspaper, and I think if people can talk about newspapers too, because they're held more, there's more accountability there than is on social media. And we're almost losing all of our newspapers. We also have local newsletters and various things we can do to highlight these things so that people don't, any tiny dent we can make in social media being the place to find stuff out, I think is helpful.
Is the local media here besides, I know there's Jewish Review? That's you. All right. What's your name?
Kaylin Cassidy. Hi.
Well, thanks for being here, Kaylin. Take a bow. Yeah.
Wilsonville spokesman. The story will be up probably tomorrow.
Oh, okay.
And please, thanks to the city for doing this as well.
Absolutely.
You know, our community is not very diverse, but I think it's coming, and I feel like we're getting ahead of it. And I think the DEI committee is a big part of that, educating us hopefully before there's problems. I mean, there's already problems, we know that, but before they get worse, or you know, we can accept people that are different from us with a good open mindset.
So if you're on that committee, can you stand up? Because I think you deserve applause. or wave your hand. Thank you. What you do is very important, and we thank you for it.
And along those lines, my name is Dana. I'm a resident here at Charbonneau. I'm also Jewish. And I've also started writing a column for The Villager that's about bringing in underrepresented voices and featuring residents at Charbonneau who aren't always represented. So I'm talking about people of color, I'm talking about younger families, I'm talking about renters. So I'm also interested in knowing who we can feature to help do more inclusive.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.